So glad that you are here. Welcome back to week 3 of the nature of God. We are certainly not looking at nature and reverse engineering what God must be like, but we are both God's revelation of himself in Scripture and his revelation of himself in the creation that he created. And I think is really helping us hopefully to see both of those in some new and better ways. And so the scriptural sort of starting point for today, I neglected to get my clicker in my pocket. So Emily, if you could just go ahead and click to the next screen, or you know what, Jim has me hooked up, and so I can do it myself. There we go. For they know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. Really pretty amazing. And so week 1, we looked at this, and we saw that in creation we can see that God has, for lack of a better word, personhood, that he has he's not like a force, or he isn't in the rocks. He's an entity, a being, and he is knowable. And even more than that, he wants to be known. Really pretty remarkable. Last week we built on that a little bit and saw that not only that, but God does things for reasons. God, he has intent, he has purpose. Things aren't random, things aren't arbitrary. Certainly, there are things that we're not able to understand, but that's the limit on our human understanding, not because God is arbitrary. He has not created things for no reason or thoughtlessly. And so today is kind of related again, a little bit of an expansion on this again, but I think it is worth expanding on, at least for some of us. And we really, you see the glory of God in ways that you just won't unless you specifically stop and look and think about some of these. So, of course, the whole series is about creation, but not necessarily the event, more the, you and me and the world around us. But something very, very simple that you may have missed in the Genesis 1 account. And yeah, sometimes the most simple things really are the most profound things. So some of you may be familiar with this, but here's a half of a verse from Genesis 1:5. Evening passed and morning came, marking the first day. Okay. There was a day that had happened, and then after that, there was evening, and then that passed, and what came next was morning. Well, a couple verses later, we see that evening passed and morning came, marking the second day. Look at that, it happened again. A couple of verses later, evening passed and morning came, marking the third day. Okay, this can't be a coincidence anymore. And so if you have never noticed this from your own personal study of Genesis 1 or from your very astute observation of the world around you, you are by now probably starting to pick up on the pattern, and you might be onto something, because evening passed and morning came, marking the fourth day. Guess what? Evening passed and morning came, marking the fifth day. If you would believe it, evening passed and morning came, marking the sixth day. Things happened in order, and they continued to happen in order. I suspect this is something that many of us absolutely take for granted. Maybe you've never thought about it. Maybe you have thought about it just enough to decide that it's not really worth thinking about. I can understand that, but I think this really means a lot more than we typically realize, that God is a God of order. Creation displays a creator where things make sense. They are comprehensible. They are, for lack of a better word, predictable. This is the opposite of chaos, the opposite of random. It's things are put together with intention, and they are put together. It's a little different context, but it's a very different context, but it's a very parallel kind of idea. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, and he says that, and he's really talking about what we would consider like a very early church service. and things are kind of chaotic. And so he says, no, you guys, you got to just like take turns, talk one at a time. Like nobody, it doesn't benefit anybody if things are just chaotic. If somebody's speaking in tongues, which is a way that the Spirit of God sometimes works, but is generally incomprehensible to most people. He says, if there's no one there to translate it and make sense of it, then you're really better off to just don't even. I mean, it doesn't help anything. And God is not a God of disorder, but a God of order. I give you that context to acknowledge that it's sort of talking about something different, but it really is the similar thing. God isn't a God of chaos or randomness. He's a God of order. And the fact that our world is generally predictable, I feel like, is tremendously unimpressive to so many people. And you very well may believe that this is a completely foolish message. Just try and give it a chance. So there is certainly much often made about a perceived conflict between science and God or the Bible. I do not believe that there is any conflict. I do believe that sometimes people who do science will take an inference or an implication and take it a couple steps further than the data really leads, but that's not a problem with science. That's just a human being. I also think sometimes people take something from the Bible and maybe take it a step or two further than is really intended. No different. It's not a problem with the Bible. It's just a human being. But I don't think there is any conflict. In fact, I have read that scientists believe in God or faith or are what we might call religious at a very similar percentage to the rest of the general population. So I think that's pretty good evidence that there's no real conflict. But I want to go a little bit deeper than that. A question that you may not have asked, but why is science worth doing in the first place? Why do we believe that there is something to be gained by doing experiments and collecting data? Well, the entire enterprise of science rests on, maybe more, but at least two fundamental foundational principles and assumptions. Here's one, is that the world is predictable and can be understood. Day goes into the evening and night is sort of included with that, and then back into day, and this happens every single time from Genesis 1 up through so far, June 7th, 2026, after death, or year of our Lord, whatever the AD thing stands for in whatever dead language, Latin. If you pour salt on ice, here's what's going to happen is the ice is going to melt. And if there's some similar ice that does not get salt on it, that ice will not melt, at least not in the same way. And so then we'll change every variable we can think of, and what we discover is that very consistently, when salt and ice come together, there's something that happens that results in the ice melting. And so here's really what that does, is that leads us to be very, very confident that the next time there is ice and salt comes on the ice, that the ice is going to melt. I know you are not particularly impressed with this. Ross, of course. Yes, when I put a cake into the hot oven, the cake bakes every time. I know. Yes, Ross, when your dog knocks her toy off the edge of the couch, it falls to the floor. Every time. I know. In fact, if this were not the case, if the laws of physics randomly turned on and off or fluctuated in some wild fashion, it is, I think, literally unimaginable what any kind of universe could even be like. Could matter even exist? Certainly not. It's just complete nonsense and chaos, right? And so science depends on the world being consistent and predictable. If the same things come together under the same circumstance, they're going to produce the same result. Okay? Number two is that human perception is basically reliable. Again, probably not impressed. This is really remarkable. So much has to happen for there to be any correlation between whatever's going on with the salt and the ice and for me to see it and perceive it and understand what's going on with any correlation to any objective reality that you almost don't even know where to start. I mean, for starters, our senses are imperfect and they're vulnerable to error. And the mechanisms by which they function are so fragile. And when I'm watching the salt melt the ice or anything else, I am never, ever directly observing objective reality. No human being, any of our senses are never directly observing objective reality. If you're all looking at me right now, you are not seeing me. Here's what's happening. Light is reflecting off of me. Some of that reflected light is entering your cornea pupil and hitting your retina. That light is not me. It is just light reflecting off of me. When it hits that retina, there are specialized cells in your eyes that convert that reflected light into still not an image, but into an electrical signal, which then gets sent to your brain, and your brain then reconstructs that electrical signal of the reflected light off of me into what you see and experience as an image, and that's what we call sight. Everything that we see or perceive in any way is at least a couple of layers removed from any objective reality. Hearing is effectively the same, except just with an ear instead of an eye and sound waves rather than reflected light. Everything. There is no objective reality that we see or experience that exists outside of your own mind. However, I'll bet you all expect that you're all seeing pretty similar things. Right? I'll bet that you're not going to be driving home today and one of you is going to say, Ross, to me appeared to be an average-ish 5'11" white guy, and the other's going to say, really, because to me it looked like a choo-choo train. It's unlikely to happen. In fact, I suspect that you're all going to agree that I look like I have short, kind of darkish hair, a little bit balding. I'm wearing this bluish short sleeve shirt. I put on shoes this morning, right? We're all going to effectively see the same thing. This is really pretty amazing. I think this is one of those things where, the less you think about it, the dumber it is. The more you think about it, it is absolutely shocking and amazing that everything that goes into our human perception ends up being basically reliable. Okay, Ross, thanks for the 5th grade science lesson. What does this have to do with anything? Here's the point. The reason science, which is 100% reliant on both the world being predictable and understandable and human perception being generally reliable, the only reason that science was initially believed to be worth doing was based on the belief in the idea that these happen and these work. These assumptions can be made because the world was created by a God who created the world to be predictable and able to be understood and created our senses to be reliable and basically to function well and appropriately. These two assumptions are absolutely unverifiable through science. I mean, without the belief in the God and the Creator, on what basis do we believe that any of this is true? On what basis do we believe that we're not in the Matrix or in a dream or some other unconsidered, who knows? But the assumptions that everything in our world and our minds cannot exist without are assumed based on the idea of a creator God who is a God of objectivity, who is a God of consistency, a God of order, and a God who has then shown those elements of himself reflected in the world that he created. Now, I know I just lost some of you. Probably going to lose a couple more. I said week 1 in this series that whoever you are, however God's made you, I'm very confident there will be at least one message that really speaks to you in the way God has created you. If this isn't it, or if the last couple, because these have all been sort of a little bit similar, I promise next week is going to be very, very different. You got to come back. And in the meantime, maybe you just enjoy that this is going to be meaningful to somebody else here. Well, let's get crazy. I'm a pastor, not a scientist. I definitely don't understand quantum stuff. I'm going to try really hard to not say anything that is incorrect. you know how there's been something that you thought you understood, but then you learned a little more. And what learning more taught you is that you don't really know as much as you thought you did, and that in fact, now that you know more, you recognize that you know less than you thought you knew when you knew less. Right? Like learning more has taught you that you know less. When we're kids growing up and we don't know anything about the world, stuff just happens. Then sometime in teenage years, you kind of start to really learn some things. And so you're like, okay, well, things are simple and people are just stupid. Then maybe either side of 20, you kind of realize that things are maybe a little more complicated than you thought when you were a teenager. And then by 35, you're like, I don't know, I'm just trying to do my best. I don't know if this analogy is really exactly accurate because I'm a pastor and not a scientist, but I really feel like that's kind of what has happened with humanity and our knowledge and understanding through science. For many, many centuries, we didn't know. I mean, you saw that you poured salt on ice and the ice melts, but all right, I don't know. Then what we now call science came along, and we started to really learn some things, and we did. Oh man, we got microscopes and we discovered electrons. And so we said, oh, okay, now I get it. See, there are these electrons and they're on the outside ring. And so then these molecules, when the salt and the ice come together, then the electrons do this bonding thing. And so then that results in the ice melts. All right, no, we get it. Then we learned a little more. And where it would seem that learning more about electrons and subatomic particles would lead to a greater and deeper understanding of our world and the way things work, it seems as though really we've just taken a big step back toward, I don't know. Remember, assumption number one was that the world is predictable and can be understood. My understanding is that on a micro level, where it would seem like things should be the most predictable and the most understandable, because everything that happens on a larger level is just a whole bunch of the little things working together, just like in anything, right? But it doesn't look that way. Here's just a Google AI overview. Quantum mechanics, which I think just means how things work on a very, very, very small level, is fundamentally random, representing a true intrinsic randomness at the subatomic level, unlike the predictive classical randomness of everyday life. While quantum mechanics can predict the probabilities of outcomes, the exact outcome of a single measurement, like an electron's position or a photon's polarization, is inherently unpredictable. Unlike classical probability, which results from incomplete knowledge, what I think that's saying is that when we say, well, it could be this or it could be this, here's the odds, that's because we don't have all of the information, right? We don't have all the knowledge. If we have all the knowledge, then we'll have certainty, not probability, right? We'll know it's going to happen because we have better understanding. Well, unlike that, quantum randomness is thought to have no underlying hidden cause. In other words, knowing more doesn't lead to any more certainty. Experiments tend to show that quantum randomness cannot be explained by human deterministic factors, which I think is kind of a way of saying, or anything. I cited a book several times last week, Bill Bryson, Short History of Nearly Everything. It'll be just one from today, but here's a quote from that. He quotes a scientist who knows things, who says, things on a small scale behave nothing like things on a large scale. Italics right in the original. And he writes, as physicists delve deeper, this is going to mess with some of you if you have not come across this. As physicists delved deeper, they realized they had found a world where not only could electrons jump from one orbit to another without traveling across any intervening space. I think that means what we would call teleport. Right? That's like if I go from here to there, but I wasn't ever in between. Not supposed to happen. Right? Not only that, but matter could pop into existence from nothing at all. Provided, in the words of a really smart scientist, that it disappears again. with sufficient haste. Now, that doesn't sound like predictability and order. That doesn't sound like you pour salt on ice and the ice melts. That sounds to me, this is maybe foolishness. I don't know, but that sounds to me like maybe you pour salt on ice and I have really no idea what's going to happen, because at the smallest subatomic, most basic level, we don't really know what's going to happen. But what in fact happens is that the ice melts every single time. Photons are very, very small. And apparently scientists have determined that each very, very small photon has what isn't described as anything better than a mysterious relationship with exactly one other photon. Physicists at the University of Geneva sent photons 7 miles from one another. If my understanding of scale is correct, that is like if the photon was the size of a pool ball, a billiard ball. One of them would be, Ohio, the other one would be in Fiji. And when they interfered with one of the photons, when they messed with it in any way, what they discovered is that there was an instantaneous response by the other photon. So if you're playing pool in Cincinnati and one of your balls moves, you're unlikely to think that's because something else moved in the Caribbean. But that's, I think, really kind of what it's like at a very, very small level. Here's what we have. Scientist says, if you aren't confused by quantum mechanics, you haven't really understood it. Another scientist says, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. Another scientist says, I think that I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics. Is there one more? Listen, what does this have to do with anything? Again, we had a fifth grade science thing, and now this is we don't even know. Why am I stumbling through things that I don't really understand and don't make any sense to anybody, at least the way we normally think of sense? Here's why. Is physicist Werner Heisenberg says the first gulp from the glass of natural scientists will make you an atheist. Keep going. Because at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you. Now, certainly there are atheistic scientists. This isn't any sort of agreed upon consensus that everybody agrees on. But what I think this means is that on a superficial level, science can feel like it's explaining everything, and why would anybody believe in magic sky fairy to start with? But then when you keep going and you get down closer to the end of the glass and you keep learning, one of the things that you learn is a clearer picture of really the inadequacy of your prior answers that just now really lead to more questions and more problems. In other words, it all points back to the God who, ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky, and through the things he created, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, and they have no excuse for not knowing God. The God who literally not only created the universe out of nothing, but then brought the chaos and the randomness into order. And the more we learn, the more we find that it really maybe ought to still be chaos, randomness, laws of physics being brazenly mocked by electrons and quarks and of things so small that our minds can't comprehend, but of such incredible numbers that our mind can't comprehend, but that still what we find is built on the shocking chaos and unpredictability is a world of order, of things being understandable, predictable, and exactly as they are supposed to go. The salt still melts the ice. A song we do from time to time, This is Amazing Grace, asks the question, who brings the chaos back into order? I don't know if they were thinking about things like this when they wrote this song, but the King of glory, the King above all kings, our King and Creator who has revealed himself to us in creating a world that, whether we understand or whatever we don't understand, through the incomprehensible vastness of space and the equally incomprehensible spin of a quark, that he has revealed himself to us. And God, I see you, I don't understand, it doesn't make sense to me, but I think that's part of the point, that day follows night, that the salt melts the ice, that we understand and are able to perceive in a real way the greater reality around us, and that in and through that, we see the God who created it all. I don't know how much of this made any sense to anybody. Part of the idea maybe is that understanding more doesn't help. And I fully acknowledge that, I don't know, maybe in 10 years or 1,000 years, there will be answers, and some of these things that don't seem to make sense will make sense, and I don't know. Here's what I think is true. Any and all mechanisms in the universe, any laws of physics, any perceived violations of the laws of physics, or violations, anything that we see and that we understand, or that we think we understand, or that we don't understand. All of this is created to point past itself to the God who created it all, because he wants you to know him. Let's pray. Father, thank you that you are so much greater than we are, that we cannot comprehend, that we can see, that we can understand just that much, that you are greater and that we do not understand. Thank you for creating a world that we can live in and have predictability and order and understand how things work, so that we can have a life that glorifies you and is the lives that you have for each one of us. And if you're here for whatever reason, you have never taken that step to connect with God through Jesus Christ. This is not particularly a Jesus died for us message, except for everything is. And as simple as can be, every one of us knows we've done things wrong. We've sinned against the creator of the universe. A human being cannot satisfy justice against the God who created them. And for God to be a good, just judge, there must be satisfaction. But that's why Jesus came, died, and resurrected. See, there's order in everything, so that he would take our sinfulness, we would take his righteousness and be forgiven adopted children in the family of God. If that's you, just right where you sit out loud or talk to God in your head, and he'll hear you. Say, God, I believe Jesus Christ came and died and resurrected, so I could be forgiven and adopted as a child in your family. Please come into my life. Forgive me and adopt me. Begin to make me into the person you created me to be. And give me the life that you have for me. And if you just prayed a prayer like that, it's never the words or the prayer that really does anything, but when we place our faith in Jesus, God's grace comes to you through that faith, and you are a new spiritual creature in Jesus. Will you please let somebody know, if there's a friend who brought you, or you can go and talk to the person at the point, that's just the corner in the lobby, let them know the decision you made. They'll take your information. We'll be able to be in touch with some good next steps for you in your new life. For the rest of us, I don't know, maybe this really is foolishness or makes no sense, or 80, 90, 100% of what I said is just the result of being a pastor, not a scientist. I don't know. But here's what we can do, is what we can know, is that we see God in everything. And that there can be nothing that would ever come into genuine conflict with the God who created all that there is. And so we look to you, and we place our faith in you, and we exist in this existence that you have placed us in for something bigger than ourselves, and that is you. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.